Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to review a 2018 film called Ride. Like, every time I also Googled this film, I always got this mixed message of either it being a 2018 film or 2019 film. I don't know why that is. But for the most part, I think it said 2018. So, I went on an app called Fox HD Movies. You can probably go into Google Play and search this and eventually go and download this app. The title will say something goofy, but and not exactly what the logo ends up saying. The logo ends up saying Fox HD Movies. You can download this app and dare in fact watch this movie for absolutely free without no fees of any kind. But I can also remind you that there's plenty of other apps that you could probably pay a couple bucks to eventually just rent and or buy this film however you want to do also. Like I think Vudu, VUDU, has this up for a couple bucks right now, or you can go into, like, I think there's like Apple TV or any number of things to eventually just support this film because it will probably get a franchise. I don't know. So going into this film, I really did actually enjoy this film. And plus, it also was a short film, also. It was like an hour and 16 some odd minutes, which I'm like, man, that's a real easy movie for me to do. like, it's like almost watching an animated movie because animated movies are about like an hour 25. So it's even like quicker than an animated film, which is like great. Good. So I went in this movie and I was like, you know what? Like, it's fairly simple concept. Like, I've seen stuff that feels familiar to this. Like, eventually you'll probably get current rungs of movies like Spree, or even remembering the Jamie Foxx, Tom Cruise movie Collateral. Uh, as if that I didn't research all of that before I came in here. No, I didn't. I just like was like, oh yeah, I remember. Like, why does this movie seem so familiar to me? And I'm like, oh yeah, I've seen XYZ whatever kind of movies that are similar to this, but they eventually go off and try to do their own thing. But while also trying to go off and do its own thing, there are points in time when obviously, like the Bruno character, eventually has these kind of lines and stuff like that that he ends up delivering. I'm like, wait a minute, these are obviously ripoffs from other movies. Like there ends up being a Taxi Driver line because I've recently seen Taxi Driver, and Bella Thorne's character, who is Jessica, mentions that. There was also to be a line that Bruno delivers where, like, you better get ready to pull the trigger kind of thing. I'm like, wait a minute, that's from like Terminator Salvation. If you're gonna put a gun at somebody, you better be ready to pull the trigger. It's like, that's from Terminator Salvation. And then of course we end up having another line delivered in this movie of a Dark Knight variety of watching the world burn. So yeah, so there's kind of some interesting kind of dips of dialogue in here. I don't know. I liked the uh, I liked the story of this. Like, it had an interesting story, and eventually it had an interesting escalation. I'm sure anybody will go through this movie and there's something that they cannot buy, or just be like, wait a minute, why is it that this guy had this gun in hand and didn't do this thing and resolve this? Why didn't this all just like be done at XYZ point? And people will say that, and I completely can understand a frustration of somebody while watching this movie to just like not go into logical, or to think logically that this could have been a movie that could have easily been resolved for whatever reason. Because there's some parts here where, like, I was also thinking that same thing too. But I just enjoyed the journey of this road trip kind of movie, because technically that's what this is. So, with that said, so what ends up happening in this movie? Let's kind of tee it up. So, we end up having a guy named James who seems to be like this movie's Uber driver. They don't say the word Uber driver. They end up just calling him like a drive app guy. So eventually it seems that we kind of re-go through certain kinds of dialogue in this movie where like I would think that would probably be confusing for maybe some actors to have to kind of rerun through talking about certain things like more than once, but it seems to have easily gone through and had people been able to easily kind of remember what they had mentioned or hadn't mentioned to other people. So, like, bravo to that. But yeah, but if I hadn't mentioned it, I think the main attraction here was Jesse T. Usher. I had recently seen him in The Boys, and so I was kind of just interested in seeing him here, kind of as just the lead role and kind of just carrying the story. Like for me, like there's something about this story where it eventually kind of plays out into this kind of like Colin Farrell phone booth kind of scenario, where eventually it kind of feels like a normal day to day kind of uh, just kind of pickups and drop offs for James, but then eventually it ends up going and escalating into one guy who just wants to just take forever getting picked up and dropped off, and so yeah, so like this guy, we get Bruno, who eventually is to be this most complicated guy, where it seems like he's like, hey man, like I'll go and I'll have you do several like stops for me, and then I'll throw in some cash, some side cash. So anyways, yeah, so it's a simple ride that eventually escalates to having a gun put into someone's head and then forced to have certain people that, let's just say, James picks up in his car to have to be forced to do side missions and has to be doing that with someone having either a gun to their head or for someone to get injured and just be like, well, hey, like you need to go and get these things because this person is hurt now. And so it's just trying to make these people criminals, forcing like these people to do things that they would never normally because they're just squeaky clean people. And eventually it pushes both James and Jessica to easily and quickly like one another because of this just spot that they are forced to be in. But man, what if Jessica would have just immediately turned James down and would not have been able to, like, there's so much about this movie where it also just like really ties onto the fact that eventually you're going to have this person get pulled back. You're going to have this all work out perfectly. And life doesn't happen that way. And so, yeah, let's go into that double five time territory and let's go out of our way to say that it is that customary time to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So James is to be, of course, doing this Uber-esque kind of thing. And so the first thing that he ends up doing is he ends up picking up a girl named Jessica. It seems like both of them are kind of having this like fun time. Jessica is to mention like there have been consistent people that would normally drive drunk, and so hence why she's kind of like going and getting this ride system so that way she doesn't have to go from a bar drunk. She can just go and have this system in place. So, uh, so eventually James is to take her off to this bar and like they're to have this nice little banter with one another where like James is to offer her like a water or a thing of gum, and Jessica's like, well, like I'm sure you have to probably like I'm sure you have to ask people that question. And he's like, yeah. Uh, James is to be wearing a very nice suit. And so, of course, Jessica is like, aren't you really like dressed up for this kind of thing? Like, what do you like moonlight as a limousine driver? And James is like, no, like I went on to do like an audition for something before I came here. And she's like, oh, audition. Like, am I going to see you anything? Like, is it going to work out? And so coincidentally, we end up having James mention that he ended up doing an audition for a henchman for Marvel of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I'm like, well, that show isn't going to be working out. Now watching that later on in life, where eventually that show is just to limp on and to consistently, uh, desperately need eventually a season to go out there somewhere. But hey, James freaking landed The Boys. Like, bravo to that. Like, man, it like it's great that like, and I actually like him on The Boys. Like, he's really Jesse Usher is really good in The Boys. I really like where his character is going. Um, but yeah, so because it also feels like eventually he's eventually going to turn into the good guy at some point in that show. But anyways, pushing on. So, but not everyone is lucky in the realm of getting jobs and whatever. But anyways, pushing on. Uh, so James is to mention that he's to get this audition for this henchman, and like it's kind of funny because everybody naturally assumes that James is going to be some villain on that show, and he's like, "Oh no, like I'm just going to be some henchman." And so they're like, "Well, hey man, like you'll get there. You'll get to be the villain on the show eventually. Like it's gonna work out." And James is like, "Well, thanks." And so Jessica just kind of like I'm gonna try to like get this dialogue very quickly done. So because like we can kind of banter off about all the things that they end up saying. Like James ended up saying something about uh, Jessica mentioning something about going to the fountain, which obviously is some celebrity who had said that, and supposedly Jessica like was like, "Oh, hey, it looks like you looked that up or you googled that or you knew." So eventually they come back to that later, and eventually they dispelled that evidently James said something incorrectly and it was actually some other celebrity instead. So like there's a lot of dialogue going on in this movie. So uh eventually Jessica gets out to her bar scene, her bar that she used to go to, and so Jessica is to offer James like, hey, if you get off in an hour, like you want to come back and go on and just share some drinks with us, or like she was kind of asking James like, hey, do you want to come and like share some drinks right now, and then you can go off to like doing some more of your job or whatever. And he's like, I'm sorry, I'm working. Like I have to. Like I've already just started my day or whatever. So Jessica's like, I completely understand, but so Jessica goes off, and James is like, why didn't I ask for her number? Like it was obvious that they were like clicking or hitting it off. And it seems like their dialogue between one another was just kind of like this guy's nice looking, and like, and so on and so forth. And so, like, James was looking at this girl's photo, and he's like, she's looking pretty good. So Jessica goes off, and he's like, God, why didn't I get the number? Like, he's like second guessing everything that he like said or did or whatever. But he ends up driving off. So because he ends up getting this next ride that is close by, but then eventually that person cancels, and so he's like, well, like, okay, I guess I have to go and uh, like turn around and figure out where the heck the next person is. And so the next person, of course, is Bruno, And it's kind of funny because James makes fun of that name to just be like, okay, Bruno, like out of all the names of the world, like your parents had to name you Bruno out of like that is the goofiest name. So James goes on to go and collect Bruno. So Bruno had supposedly like his girl had dumped him, and so he is like, okay, well, I'm just gonna get out of this location, and so Bruno is eventually already being like very difficult, like to where Bruno is lighting his cigarette, and Bruno is gonna get in the car, and James is like, "Hey man, no smoking in my car," and he's like, "Man, but these cigarettes are really expensive, and like I can't just let this go," and so eventually he just like flicks the cigarette anyways. So because he ends up getting a couple of drags at it, and then he just flings it. So Bruno gets in the car, and so of course we have James, who's just like, "Hey man, where are we going?" And it feels like Bruno is just kind of giving him the runaround, where it's just kind of like, "Oh, we'll just head west, or just like kind of go here, or just kind of like head in this direction. I'll try to figure things out." Like the first thing that Bruno is to end up doing is to mention that he has a friend, and so just start to like head that way. Oh no, wait. The very first thing that he ends up actually saying is he's trying to figure out like what friends that he is to eventually bunk with. But the very first thing that Bruno is to say is that there is to be this coffee spot, and they have this like this great thing of coffee that he'll go and get one for himself, and he'll go and get one for James. And evidently, the place is called Nobody's Backwards. So eventually they go into this bar, they go into this coffee place, and so they end up getting this coffee where Bruno ends up having this long stretch of dialogue about how like weird and unique that this coffee is. And so it's like bizarrely some kind of like yak coffee, which is like, okay, that's weird. So eventually James is to take a sip of this coffee, and I'm like, hopefully this coffee isn't drugged, because I would just be so suspicious about getting a coffee from another person I don't know. And so all of a sudden, James is to take the coffee, and he's like, you know what, this is really good, like surprisingly good. And the guy's like, heck yeah. So the next place there to go is to this friend's place, or maybe friend, I don't know, because what ends up happening, so like they go to this guy's supposed friend's place, and so Bruno is to eventually talk to James and just kind of mention like, hey man, like what are you doing besides going and doing this job, doing the whole ride job, as like consistently there is to be a thing of this ride app asking like, James, put in a location. And we have Bruno, who's just like, dude, is that gonna like, can you shut that off, can you like whatever? And James is like, I'm sorry man, like you need to actually put an actual destination where this is going to end. And Bruno is to mention, it's like, well, hey, like I'm gonna give you like we're gonna go on several stops tonight. And I'm gonna give you an extra $100, like in my hand, to give to you, to just kind of make up for like this pain and suffering. And James was mentioning, it's like, well, like, dude, I have somewhere to go in like an hour. Like, could we kind of like rush this thing up? So but yeah, so what ends up happening is that Bruno was talking to James and like mentioning like, "Hey man, or like, did you come from a funeral? Like, what's going on? Like, why do you have all the clothes and whatever?" So eventually, but also James is like, "Do you got any like thing going on just besides this? Like, are you trying to get somewhere else while just doing this kind of thing? Like." So is this all that's meant for you kind of thing? And so James is to mention like, well, hey, like I'm also doing auditions. And so Bruno's like, hey, where? Like stage or like screen or like what are you doing? And so he also mentions that he was the henchman on eight Marvel Agents of Shield, and Bruno's like, really? Like as the villain? It's like, no, it's just some henchmen. And he's like, "Hey man, like we'll get you there. Like we'll get you. Like it's gonna happen." And so like we weirdly have James, who's kind of just really just uh like happy he met Bruno, but there's also this just like he's almost like saying that like they're close to seemingly buddies. Because eventually Bruno is to say like, "Hey man, have you ever had any like stage experience or anything like that? Like, do you know any like Shakespeare or something? Can you give me a monologue or something?" And so James is like, well, maybe I might have some. And like Bruno was like, dude, I'll give you like 50 or $100 bill if you could just like give me some kind of Shakespeare monologue, something. Like, give me some Henry the Third. Like, man, he's my favorite. And so James is like, well, I don't know any Henry the Third, but I do know Henry the Second. And Bruno's like, yeah, like hit me with that. And so all of a sudden we have James who has this long stretch of dialogue, which is like, this is amazing that he memorized all of this stuff because of how complicated it is. Like, uh, like there are very few movies where you end up having someone do a Shakespearean monologue. Like I remember Renaissance Man, where like we had the one guy who ends up spouting like "We Happy Few" and stuff like that, uh, and like calling people his brother and stuff like that. Like in the Renaissance Man, just because that whole entire movie was to just really talk about Shakespeare, to where eventually we had the one guy just spouting to the one soldier like, "Hey, give me Shakespeare," and he ends up doing that whole "We Happy Few" whatever soldier kind of thing, calling people his brother. And I was like, man, like very rarely do we ever get like Shakespearean monologues like ever in day to day things. Like it's always just simple line delivery and whatever. But like I guess this is really just to really just give Jesse Usher like a real like portfolio of really just going and just like, hey man, like not only just to have this on his resume, but to also just be like, hey, I spouted some Shakespeare in a ride movie, to just kind of really just see the diverse um, or amount of interesting stuff that James, or in this in real actual, that Jesse can do. Which bravo to that. Like I can't spout any of the words of which that he said, because freaking Shakespeare dialogue is a lot of there's a lot of words to say and whichever. So check it out in the movie. Go on to any number of things to eventually watch this. So pushing on. So eventually they get to the location, and so Bruno is to just kind of tell Jesse to kind of like turn all the lights off and just kind of wait for him. And James is like, "Are you sure? Like, are you sure that like this person is waiting on you?" And Bruno's like, "Yeah, man, like just like this is a bad neighborhood." So Bruno goes into this house, and so James is waiting, and he ends up calling a friend of his, or like his like one of his friends or something. He ends up going through this thing of dialogue, just kind of catching up, or just kind of like, yeah, no, man, it's been a long time, and so on and so forth. So eventually James is to wrap up that phone call, and so Bruno is to come back. James is to hear this loud pop, and he wasn't quite sure what that was. Maybe a car backfired or something like that. And so all of a sudden, they end up driving off, because it's like, well, that guy, like, I guess, like, didn't want to go and take in Bruno for whatever reason. Like, James could have just been like, dude, I'm gonna get the F out of here. like this, but it seems that Bruno had consistently won James over to where it's just like, hey man, like I'll stick with you till the end of this for whatever reason, and plus that money that he's gonna get at the end of this for all the stuff that he's doing for this guy. So eventually, what ends up happening is we end up seeing a patch of blood on Bruno's shirt, and you would have thought that James would have had like a red flag about that. Just like, you got a little blood on your shirt there. But Bruno has mentioned that supposedly he ends up getting nosebleeds. So James is just supposedly by that story and be like, hey man, do you need any like do you need any Kleenex, man? Like you might be bleeding. But it is kind of funny because uh, we end up immediately having like Bruno like going and trying to use like every little thing to his advantage when Bruno is to first get there. Bruno is like, hey man, like I know you usually offer like water and gum or whatever. Do you have any of that water? James gives him that water and then he doesn't even use it. And then eventually Bruno is to ask James for some gum. So he gives him that. And then he ends up like asking for a thing of paper to go and spit the gum out and put it in his thing. Like, man, you could have just rolled down the window and spat out the gum. Like, I don't know how many times people would probably do that, but a lot of people call that pollution or whatever. But still, it's freaking gum. Anyways, so uh, so let's get to the more interesting parts of this movie. So Bruno is to eventually ask James what that thing that he was supposed to go to uh for like that hour away or whatever. And so James goes and he's like, well, yeah, like, you know what? Like, I was thinking about this girl and maybe I was going to go back to this bar, maybe hope that she's not there, freaking drunk off of her butt because this is taking way too long now. And who knows how drunk this girl would have gotten and how many poor decisions she's going to make, aka also coming with James to get into this car. So Bruno is just like, hey man, like, how about we go back to that bar? Like, this is gonna be like your like the love of your life, maybe. Like, she's maybe just pining away, like hoping that you're gonna come through that door, and I squashed that. Like, so, like, we need to go to this bar, and you need to go and win this woman over. Just kind of smooth talk her into coming back with us because supposedly Bruno has some friend in Malibu that has this jacuzzi, and it's like, hey man, like smooth talk her to get her out there so that way we can go and do this. So James goes back into the bar and sees that there's like a long line, and James is like, okay, Bruno, how am I going to be able to get through this bar? And so Bruno's like, dude, just say Bruno Anthony is here and you're wanting to see him. And so James ends up going to these people, and weirdly, that whole thing ends up working. So James goes into this bar, and so he ends up speaking to Jessica. And of course, he does the one liner that Bruno is to tell him to do. Um, and we also have a moment where like Jessica is to think like, oh hey, like so you're done for the night, and James is like, no, like I'm still like I have a guy with me, and it seems like we're being buddy buddy right now. So like, hey, how about we go to this other location that's this jacuzzi in Malibu? How about we check that out? And I'm like, if I was probably Jessica, I would have said no, just because of the fact that it's like even though she's talked to this guy, James, before, and it seems like she can trust him, I would have said no for the fact that really this girl is drunk and she's going into a location that she is really just not familiar with. And she's not going with friends, she's going by herself. I wouldn't have trusted that. But like, I don't know, I guess Jessica was like, well, maybe that this will lead to me and James kind of, just going further into our not knowing much about one another ship. So Jessica goes back in the car, and so Bruno is just kind of like take the car and go on a joyride. He is to adjust the locks on the passenger car. So, and then he ends up going back, and so James is kind of mad because Bruno had like kind of left. And Bruno was like, "Hey man, like freaking, like I would have been towed if I would have stayed there any longer." So like that was the reason why I left. And he's like, okay, fine. So they end up going into the car, and so now here's where we get the really exciting story. So Bruno is like, hey man, let's go to this liquor store and go and get some hooch, and then go to my place supposedly. So they go to this liquor store, and so James is to now need to supposedly go into this liquor store because Bruno is like, yeah, like go into this liquor store and go and get me a certain kind of liquor and then basically empty out the register. And James is like, what now? And Bruno is like, yeah. And so all of a sudden, Bruno is to hold a gun to this guy's head, and James is like, is this gun even real? And so eventually, what ends up happening is Bruno is to hold the gun on, of course, Jessica or, of course, James, and just say, like, hey, man, uh, like Jessica starts to get out of the car, but she, of course, can't. And so now Bruno is to basically tell James that you need to go to this convenience store. And I'm like, wait a minute. Like, James seemingly has the only gun here. Why wouldn't he have gotten out of the car and then gotten Jessica out of the car? Because wouldn't he have been able to do that? And then left. Because it didn't seem like Bruno had two guns. It only seemed like he only ever had the one gun in this entire film. So, but Bruno was threatening that he could hurt Jessica, so I guess that's good enough to just have James do this task. So James goes in, and so guns are being pulled. The guy behind the counter has a gun, and so James has a gun. And supposedly, like when James comes back, he ends up mentioning that he ended up shooting the clerk, supposedly. But James is to mention to this guy, this clerk guy, to just like, hey man, call the cops. This whole thing is going down. Blah 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 blah. So eventually, James gets the liquor that Bruno requested, and so they end up going off and drinking. And so what eventually ends up happening is that Jessica, when they were to get out of the car, oh, we forgot about the dancing moment. There was when Jessica and James were to, like, Bruno was driving the car, and so Bruno told James and Jessica to get out and dance, like in front of the street anywhere. And so they just went out and just started doing these, like all this kind of like variation of dancing. It's kind of like uh, there was some kind of like different styles kind of thrown in there. There was a bunch of like different kind of like actual dancing, like some kind of dips and stuff like that. But then eventually there was some uh like combination of stuff. It was like a God, what is the perfect word? Like a salsa or something, where there was like these weird kind of like hand move gesture, whatever things. But anyways, it was interesting. So so eventually they did a whole video kind of like remembering this moment. But anyways, so So eventually, what ends up happening is while they're drinking, Jessica is to mention to James that she adjusted the child locks because they got out of the car. And so she adjusted the child locks so eventually she can get the heck out of there. So what ends up happening is Jessica is to be writing up front. And so what ends up happening is uh, Bruno and James are fighting with the gun, and so Jessica runs off to go and almost jump into this bus. But then all of a sudden, Bruno gets the upper hand and separates James's shoulder, and then is to hold a gun on James. And so Bruno is trying to test Jessica to see if she'll come back for James, and of course she ends up doing so. And so James is to tell Jessica, it's like, why did you come back? Why did you come back for me? Like, you could have left. Like, yeah, I would have died, but who cares? But we're really starting to really cement. Like, I think Bruno is like the master at work here because, and that's the wrong thing to say, but think of it this way. Like, we're really showing that these people, like, that both Jessica and James, like, we're cementing these people's relationship more and more as the night is to go on, that it seems that eventually both Jessica or James will try to protect one another and look out for one another. And that's the thing that I like about this movie is we have both these characters that eventually will kiss one another by the end of this night because their lives are in one another's hands and they're trying to protect one another. So that's the masterfully crafting thing of maybe not Bruno, because that's a horrible thing to actually have said. Like, the story, like, gets these people to trust one another so much so, or try to figure things out between one another to try to get this thing to be over. And like Bruno is creating this situation where these two people are to seemingly more and more just want to depend on one another in whichever. So now we end up going into this situation because Bruno had to separate James's shoulder. So Bruno is like, well, okay, now Jessica, you're going to need to go into this store and shoplift like a like an arm brace and painkillers and like a wood piece for James to bite on, because now Bruno is going to reset James's shoulder and hope it works. Because eventually James is going to be a lot of pain when the shoulder gets popped back in. And I'm like, yeah, I've kind of had I've like dislocated like my knee, where eventually like I kind of wrapped my leg around a freaking ladder and my knee kind of seemed to pop out of place, but I ended up just popping it back into place. And then I just walked because like here's the thing, like it was during a work shift, and like it was at the very freaking beginning, of course, of this work shift. So like I just popped it back in, like I filled out a report the next day. But yeah, so I just freaking just limped freaking the rest of the night because really it was the worst possible day to have injured or hurt or anything of my leg. And so like because they were moving mattress freaking crap around, in all brutal honesty. So I was like, yeah, you're the only one that could actually do this. So, in all brutal honesty, because they had like it's a store mostly with with females, and but I wasn't gonna go to the doctor to freaking like, oh, I'm just gonna get out of the shift and I'm just gonna go to the doctor. No, who cares? I was just gonna pop the freaking thing back in because it's kind of what eventually you're just like, well, hey man, like, do you want to go to the doctor and have to like spend money, or do you want to just pop your knee freaking back in and just make money doing this job that eventually you'll just be like, why am I doing this? And eventually the store closed anyways. Man, was that great? Uh, it closed because, of course, it did. It closed because, like, they had people do absurd jobs that made no longer any sense for anyone to do. But this is a bitter bitty about me. Anyways, pushing on. I made this about me and it shouldn't have, because who cares? Anyways, pushing on. Hopefully people like this review. They'll be like, God, like, why? Why did he say that? For honesty. So, pushing on. So, Jessica goes off and is to suddenly shoplift all this stuff without a hitch. Nobody says a thing. Jessica tries to mumble something to this worker to say, like, help me, but, like, she tries to mouth it, like, but, of course, Bruno the whole entire time was to have, said that that Jessica needed to have a, cell phone on her and she needed to be humming something the whole entire time so he knows that she's there. What she could have done was she could have gone and get some kind of marker or something and eventually just wrote on something and said, like, help me. Like, guy with a gun outside, call 911, help me. Like, she could have done that, but she didn't. Because, again, that would have maybe quickly resolved something, or someone would have probably ended up dead, aka James. So, Jessica gets this stuff, and of course, now we have Bruno who ends up resetting James's shoulder, which I'm sure that wasn't fun if that was to have actually happened in this thing. But I'm sure there's been plenty of people that have had their like shoulder separated or whatever. I'm sure it's not the greatest, funnest time, anyways. Luckily, I've never had that happen, but like you always get worried of having just several injuries, and you're to a lot of times think you're lucky stars that you hadn't been ridiculously injured, because there's a lot of times where it's like, how am I not injured yet? How have I not broken a bone or crazily done some kind of injury? Because for doing what some people do, like you just think that, why am I not injured right now? Like, why am I not like, I should be injured? Like, there was a lot of dangerous stuff that you end up doing and you question it for whatever reason. But then you think you're lucky stars that it never happened to you. So, pushing on. Just the bitter old biddy. Anyways, so eventually what ends up happening is we are to eventually have Bruno go on and tell them, okay, hey guys, we're going to head to this Malibu house, and then we're going to finish up this whole thing, and everybody's going to go into this hot tub and just enjoy this time together. So what ends up happening is James is to decide that since he's driving, that he's going to accelerate, especially once we get to a certain part of this road. So James accelerates the car and is to crash the car, and so Bruno, I guess, in between the seats, I guess, is kind of just disoriented or whatever. Like, you would have thought that, like, James really should have put the pedal to the metal, because was Bruno really, like, seat buckled? If that's a no, then, man, he could have really just, like, put the pedal to the metal and then put a brake on it, and Bruno could have went flying from the back seat into the windshield, because that just happens all the time in movies where you kind of see that kind of thing. I don't think it works in real life where all of a sudden you just have a person that just like they're going really really fast and then like careening through the windshield, and like the person ends up flying out and it works perfectly. Um, I feel like there's also a moment that I missed here. Also, like there was a some kind of moment, but I don't remember what it was. Uh, that happened like right before here. Oh, anyways, but yeah, I mentioned all the lines, but I didn't mention where they were in the movie. Oh well, like eventually, like well, people will watch the movie and they'll know where the lines came from. Um, I think it was something with the store with Jessica. I don't remember. Oh well, pushing on. Uh, so Bruno eventually is to get hurt, and so both Jessica and James are running off to try to knock on this door to see if anybody's there. No one is there, so they end up running into the backyard, and evidently, since neither one of them can hop this fence, and plus also like James is with his shoulder thing, so they decide instead that they're going to make it seem like they ran off and jumped the fence, and instead they're going to be underneath this pool. And so Bruno is just like, okay, well, like I'm gonna go and look around and kind of see like where they went and blah 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 blah. But he ends up turning a light on. Coincidentally, there's a light for this pool, and like I'm just like, man, this has to like perfectly work out for a person to have a lighted pool to just have things work out perfectly for this. But anyways, like, hey, like, eventually it just gets to the moment where both Jessica and James are to kiss in this pool because they might die soon, maybe. So eventually, Bruno's to turn the light on to find out that these two lovebirds are to be in this pool, and so they get out. And so now Bruno is to tell James to complete this ride, and because uh, James's app is there. It's kind of funny because Bruno ended up hitting the phone and cracked it. I'm like, you cracked a guy's phone? Like, come on! Like, you know how much of a pain in the butt it is to like just have a cracked screen and have to replace a phone? Like, I've had cracked screens, and I'm like, dude, I'm never gonna replace this phone. Cause it's just a bird. Like how many? Like I even on my current phone, like I have a little like crack in the thing, but it's fine. And but I'm like, I don't want to get a brand new phone. Like if I can just easily use the phone, I'm not gonna get a brand new phone because I just don't want to go through the hassle and the arduous process of having to go through and like you lose all your photos. Not only that, but then you also just you freaking have to just go through and like re-download every single app that you've ever done in your life, and it's just like a real hard process, a real burden of things. But I know it's like, well, there's SoundClouds and stuff like that that people can easily. No, it's not. It seems like an easy thing, but then it's just no, it's not. So, anyways, pushing on. So eventually, what ends up happening is that James is to force these people to go and take off their clothes. They're not going in naked. So they end up going in their underwear, and so we also end up there's one spot that I didn't even think that I was going to remember here. Jessica ends up singing a little bit in this movie. Bella Thorne ends up singing because Bruno, of course, requested it. Bruno. Bella Thorne was also in The Masked Singer, so it's like, oh, okay, well, like, obviously when she was singing here, I was like, okay, like, I know, like, she was in The Masked Singer, so she can sing. So she ended up singing this one song. I was like, okay, that's nice. So, that's nice. So, but anyways, it's mood point. So, they get into the jacuzzi, and we have Bruno, who's to ask, like, of course, he ends up asking Jesse, or he ends up asking James, like, hey, do you work out? It's like, well, hey, he's like a superhero for a living. Do you think he does not work out? Like, he basically has to wear spandex, and like that's basically how close can you look like you're naked in front of the world for I don't know how long. Um, But also we have Jessica, who doesn't look too shabby too, because I'm sure they prepared for this working out scene for however long to look good. In like, plus it might be just like bathing suits this season anyway, so they just probably like their bodies always look like that. They always look great. So Bruno is to be like, ooh, for Jessica and her way of going to this jacuzzi. So eventually, what ends up happening is we have reasonably just Bruno, who is to kind of take all the bullets out of the gun, with I think the exclusion of one, and like just kind of he dumps most of the bullets into the jacuzzi, and so Bruno is to kind of like say that James should be grateful for all the things that he helped him do and he helped him accomplish here, and how eventually, like, whatever is going to happen to James after this moment is going to make James like a much better person after all of this. Because Bruno is like, hey man, like uh, you went out and you got the girl, and like, and you ended up like doing that whole Shakespearean line and all this and that. Like, man, you've made it. Like, if anything, like you're living the sweet life. You're gonna like go and uh, like anything that you do after this is gonna be like a great thing. So eventually, Jessica is to whisper sweet nothings to James before they get into the pool, and Jessica is telling James like we have to get that gun. So eventually, what happens is James does get the gun away from Bruno, but James does not fire the gun. Basically, both Jessica and James just get the F out of there and leave. And so all of a sudden, Bruno is just kind of sitting there. And so all of a sudden, like, Bruno is to have the app. And evidently, there's another person wanting a ride. And so Bruno, without a car, weirdly, I guess maybe he hotwires one, is to eventually just accept the newer ride and call this woman ahead of time, just like, hey, I'm running a little late, like like just wait for me, I'll be there, like and so evidently we end up having where all of a sudden uh Bruno is to be this Uber driver, or maybe he's eventually going to be the guy who's kind of like the guy from Spree. Well, eventually we don't realize that this guy is to be eventually a bad guy. Plus, also, I don't know how exactly that this woman is going to want to easily drive with this guy with a wound upon his head, but I guess we'll just figure that out. So, that's what I wanted to talk about. Jessica was in the shop and that going and getting that splint and whatever thing. She ended up finding out about Bruno Anthony's like life story, where it seems that Bruno was to mention that things weren't working out with his girl, and it seems like there was a lot more going on for that, but it wasn't quite going on right now. Like, it seems like that was a thing done long ago, and it seems that also Bruno kind of vanished away from his club of which that he owned, that I guess luckily was Jessica's club that she went into. And so Jessica got a lot of the backstory of Bruno, and there are parts where Jessica tries to like psychologically like get Bruno to stop doing this, or to try to figure out how she could kind of uh, like negotiate or some kind of something where she is to kind of get this guy to stop doing what he's doing in this situation, but it doesn't work out. And so eventually Jessica goes back to that, to like finding out about Bruno, because it seemed that Bruno ended up finding out so much about them. Like we end up having a moment where they're driving to this Malibu spot, and so Bruno is like, "Well, hey, since I know so much about both of you, I am gonna give you a moment of something that you're gonna find out about me." And so all of a sudden he ends up just cranking up the music, and it's some R. Kelly song, and they end up singing the R. Kelly song because evidently this guy knows all the words, and so he forces both Jessica and James to sing along. But yeah, like I think that's where I want to leave off of this review. But that's kind of like a not current part. It just happens somewhere in the movie. But I just want to get all of that out so I can just know that I covered most of this film, or at least most of the scenes are to be covered, or whatever. But I also wanted to rush through. But anyways, because who knows if anybody really cares about this movie? In all honesty, hopefully I'm wrong, because that always really helps the channel, and that always just helps just me. So thank you, and goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.